the people who made the genetic disc conceivably are attacking us through their incredibly advanced and sophisticated telecommunications that they had 6,000 years ago.
Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology are the study of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs, no, we don't.
You're listening to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast, a critical examination of the world of pseudo-archaeology and the misrepresentation of archaeology in the world today. Each episode, we focus the lens of archaeology on a topic and discuss reality versus fantasy. We've covered everything from ancient aliens to crystal skulls, from DNA to modern fakes. Join us for our discussion this week and get ready to think critically.
Digging in a trench, monuments, going to the pub when the day
Welcome to the Archaeology Fantasies Podcast. We tackle the hot topics in today's fringe archaeology and alternative history from a critical point of view. I'm your host, Sara, with my co-host, Kenneth Fader. This is episode 2, where we go over Ken's pseudo-archaeology checklist and use it as we discuss the genetic disc. Fact or fiction? Get ready to think critically.
Welcome, everybody, back to the next episode of the Archae Fantasies Podcast. I'm your host, Sara, and I'm here with Ken Fader.
There you go.
Hi,
everybody. Hi, Sara. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you doing today?
We are good. We're hitting that kind of typical New England ice storm time of year, which is not particularly good, but I guess we'll survive it.
So you guys actually have weather, because it's been pleasant here.
Yeah, I mean, the deal here is we've had a ton of rain, and the atmosphere is a little bit too warm for snow. But what's going on is that we've had a bunch of cold weather, and so the ground surfaces are really cold. So as soon as the rain hits them, freezes instantly. And so you got a lot of accidents, tractor trailers turning over on highways because they hit those icy patches of black ice. And it doesn't make any difference if you've got chains, if you've got studs, if you've got four-wheel drive. You just kind of go sailing off into the sunset. So that's been kind of miserable for all today was terrible.
We're waiting on that to hit here, but so far we've just had the drizzly rain.
Yeah.
So enough about the weather.
Sure.
Today I wanted to talk about the genetic disc, and I sent you a bunch of stuff to read. What did you think?
Yeah. The thing about the genetic disc, I have to admit something to you, Sara. Before we kind of talked about this a little bit a couple of weeks ago, I had heard of it, and it basically was off my radar. So I've been reading up a whole lot of stuff on it, and the thing I really like about this, Sara, is that it's this wonderful example, a wonderful case study of kind of pathological archaeology. And it's a really good example. One of the things I do in my classes is I give the kids a checklist of these are the kinds of things to look at when you're looking at kind of weird archaeology. Is this legit or isn't it legit? And if you can check off more than half of the boxes, put your hand on your wallet because somebody's trying to pick your brain. And man, this one, the genetic disc, it's like you check every box, and we'll probably talk about that today. The kinds of general approaches that you see in this, that you see in so many other examples of fake archaeology, of pseudo-archaeology. So in that sense, man, it's a great thing for us to talk about today.
Okay, well, let's give people a little bit of background to what the genetic disc is, because not everybody knows about it. And one of the reasons I wanted to cover it was because it's so new, or at least it's newer than most of the other things we will have a chance to talk about on the show. So it came to my attention by one of my readers of the blog. They sent it to me and was like, "What do you think about this?" And I looked it over and I just wrote it off. I wrote him back and I was like, "Oh, it's obviously a fake."
Right.
And I did the same thing like you did. It didn't even hit my radar. I'm like, "This thing is obviously a fake. Look at it."
Right.
And then I had like 2 more people email me about the same artifact. And I was like, so I went and looked at it.
Sure.
And so what it is, since this is basically radio and we're going to describe something that's visual, it looks to be about the size of a dinner plate.
Right.
It's round like a record. It looks to be maybe a few inches thick.
Yeah.
It's solid
at least
black.
A couple inches, yeah.
Yeah. It's solid black, and to my eye, it looks like it's been molded. It looks like it's a poured mold of some sort. But judging from Dr. Vera Hammer's discussion about it that she and I had, apparently it is carved, but it's it's carved in a way that you can tell that modern tools have been used on it.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Which is what gives it that perfect polished look.
Right.
And apparently there were also some other artifacts that were found in quotes in association with the disc itself.
Right.
And all of those are dubious as well.
Right.
And they're all
the thing
made.
Is too, right? There's a big hole in the middle of it, right? It almost looks
It's like a record. Yeah. It looks like a buy disc. It looks like a really, really thick buy disc, which there's another name for those that runs around in the conspiracy theorist circles, but I can't remember it right off the top of my head. So what did you think when you first looked at it? I mean,
I looked at one of the things that gets me about these things, Sarah, is that it doesn't make any difference how goofy these things look. How amateurishly done they are, is that people just kind of glom onto them. I mean, you see this again and again, where it looks like a third grader carved some of these images. It's like the Michigan relics and a number of other archaeological fakes, where you just look at it and you go, seriously? This is supposed to be some spectacular piece of technology? It looks kind of childish. So that was my first impression. But then I went and actually read some of these websites, and then I got even more excited about this because, again, there are just, you can just go down a checklist of things to look for when you're looking at archaeological fakes. And man, you just keep on checking these boxes. It's like these guys read my book and said, well, we got to do what Fader says we shouldn't do to pull off a fake. It's again and again and again. If you'd like, I'll go down my list, and then I have a couple of questions to ask you, actually, because you actually contacted Vera Hammer, right?
Yeah, and I actually had some contact with the guy who was claiming to be the one who's touting them as actual artifacts. He contacted me on Facebook, but that didn't go anywhere. But yeah, go ahead. Go through your checklist first, and then we'll talk about my conversation with Dr. Hammer.
So one of the things you got to be really careful about, and this is really a kind of a dead giveaway, it's diagnostic, is that a lot of these fake archaeological artifacts or bizarre stories, they very often will contact legitimate scientists in order to get some sort of feedback or some sort of confirmation. And the thing is, you have to read very carefully exactly what these scientists have said. Now, Sarah, I bet you and me are the same. Our mothers raised us right. And when somebody approaches us with some bizarre thing, we're polite. We don't necessarily say, oh, you know what, you're a moron, don't ever email me again. We respond with things like, well, wow, that's interesting. Good luck researching this. And that kind of stuff gets glommed onto by these people as somehow affirmation or verification. If you look at, now, Vera Hammer is a real deal scientist. And if you look at the exact quote, and I've got here, I'll pull up a quote from one of the websites that says, hey, listen, she's involved in this, and all it says is, Dr. Vera M.F. Hammer, expert for precious stones and minerals, analyzed the object. That's the entire quote.
Yeah.
But that's viewed as, well, that's affirmation. See, she looked at it. Well, what does that mean? She looked at it. Does that mean she said, oh, my God, this is 6,000 years old. This has inexplicable information? She didn't say that. All we get from that is, well, she looked at it. And I'm sure that rather than her, attacking these people and saying, oh, what are you, crazy? She responded in a polite way saying, hey, listen, I'll analyze the object, but that's the extent of it, and that's typical kind of stuff. Years ago, I reviewed a book called Forbidden Archaeology, which is kind of it's kind of Hindu creationism, and I absolutely tore the book apart, but I was polite in saying things like, well, it's well written, and it was. I think one of the authors, in fact, was a journalist, so it was well written, and a couple of years after I wrote the review, somebody contacted me saying, well, gee, Fader, why did you so positively review Forbidden Archaeology? And I said, what are you talking about? Well, because somebody pulled that one polite quote out of the review, and they used that to advertise the book, ignoring all of the other stuff that I said.
Well, it's really... it's really one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't situations. If you're not nice and you're even remotely rude about it, they'll just jump all over you for being one of those academics. And if you are nice about it, you got to be really careful. And even then, you really can't be careful enough, because they'll just cherry pick what you have to say until it means whatever they want it to mean.
Absolutely. I mean, that actually is, it's kind of thematic that when professionals, archaeologists and geologists and astronomers will be sent books. I get sent books that are privately published, right? They're not published by any large publication house, and I will write back a nice note saying, "Thank you very much for your book. I'm sure it will be very interesting." And then that turns up as professional archaeologist Ken Fader has looked at this book and he thinks we're on the right track. And it's like, whoa, wait a minute.
That's not what I said.
When you contacted Vera Hammer, what did she tell you about her involvement? Now, she's a real deal, not an archaeologist. What is she, a geologist?
Yes. No. She is a mineralogist.
Okay.
She and I had a very interesting interaction. I tried to contact her before I published the blog, and I wasn't able to get to her.
Right.
And I just figured she didn't want to respond because I was asking directly about the disc, and I don't blame her for being like, no, not dealing with it.
Right.
So I just kind of figured that she had blown me off because she thought I was one of the crazy crackpots.
Right.
So after I published the blog, apparently she and I have a mutual acquaintance through Twitter, and that person passed my post on to her, and she read it that way. And she was not very happy about being in the blog, about being mentioned in the blog post. In the original post, I just mentioned who she was, and I said, and she is a geologist, and as a geologist, she is not qualified to comment on the cultural implications of an artifact. I never implied that she had, even though there are websites out there that do. And I was trying to get people to realize that geologists are not archaeologists, and so they can't really comment on the cultural value of an object, which is what those were the words that were being put into her mouth. And apparently it came off wrong. So she and I had an exchange over email, and it was actually very civil. Sure. And I said, I know you've had contact with this artifact. I know what's being said on the internet. Why not you give me your take on it, and I will publish it word for word on my blog.
Brilliant, right.
So she did, and I'm really glad that she did that because, I mean, I learned a couple things about it. I'm not a geologist, so I didn't know there was a difference between these two different schist and chert, because I thought it looked cherty, and she said it was schist, and I was like, I don't even know what that is, so we will go with what you say. But once I got her talking about it, she was part of a team that looked at it, and this guy named Klaus Donna brought it in. Let's see, she said she was asked in 2001 by Klaus Donna who curated an exhibit called Unsolved Mysteries in Vienna.
Of course.
And they did an XRD analysis of the objects that he was exhibiting, and I linked to that. Basically, it was they analyzed the mineral makeup of the artifacts to see if it was I think he thought that they could date the objects, but it's my understanding that it's impossible to date stone itself.
Okay.
Like beyond, it's several million years old,
Yeah, right.
It's a rock.
Right. You can date stone, but that doesn't date to when somebody made something out of that stone.
Yeah, exactly.
We have basalt artifacts here in the Farmington Valley, and the basalt is between 100 and 200 million years old.
Right.
Well, I can make a basalt artifact today. If you dated it, you could find out through potassium argon dating that that's 100 million years old. But the artifact itself, the thing I made, is actually 10 minutes old. So yeah, you can date the rock, but that doesn't do you any good.
Right, and I think Mr. Donna was trying to. I think what he wanted was something that he could twist into saying, because I know that he does say that the stone that the artifacts are made out of is harder than diamond, and she was like, I don't even understand why that's important because it's completely stupid and blah 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 blah. I mean, she was very nice about it, but I'm the one being unnice about it.
Right.
But she did say that the genetic disc, this is her entire analysis of it. She says, our comment about the disc was that it consisted of feldspar, quartz, and mica. That was all she said about it.
Alert the media.
Right. And so herself and some of the other people on the team that did the analysis, told Donna and the rest of his people that these were probably very likely to be fakes, and that you could go down into the town and buy them. You could buy replicas of these in the town.
Shades of the Ica stones.
Right, because they were just basically mass produced by the locals there. And obviously that's not what Mr. Donna wanted to hear. So he went on to create this story that the rock is harder than diamond, so there's no tool on Earth that could possibly carve it, and except for the fact that we cut diamond all the time. And I forget what his other claims were exactly, but he just really hyped this up, and then would throw in little lines about how Dr. Vera Hammer said this, therefore the objects are real.
Right. And
when in reality, they're not. And she was very, very blunt about it.
Well, that's typical. That's exactly what we're talking about. That somebody is given an artifact, given a book, given it a website, and they comment. Their comments are innocuous and not particularly meaningful in terms of what claims are being made. And yet the mere fact that they commented on this object at all is used as, you see? Right. Here's an important person with training who has thought enough about this that she's actually looked at it and commented on it, and then ignoring, of course, what she said.
Yeah,
which is kind of crazy. I also saw in one of the websites, and this is another name, I don't recognize the name, but it's the quote is, University Professor Dr. Rudolf Distelberger, internationally recognized expert for precious stones and director of the Schatzkammer in Vienna, said that the disc has a very complex content. Now, what does that even mean? Does that mean anything? Is that somehow supporting their hypothesis that this is and thousands of years old, and that it conveys some detailed biological or genetic information that people could not have had back then? Well, it does nothing of the kind. But the guy's got he's a professor, he's a doctor, he's from Vienna, he's internationally renowned. Just the mere fact that his name is included in these discussions on the internet gives this thing the patina of validity, when in fact nothing this man has said reflects on any of the claims being made. But the mere fact that his name is there, they think it's like cult archaeology, like we talked about last time. It's like merely using somebody who's got a PhD and is a university professor, no matter what he really said, that gives us some support, when it in fact doesn't.
Right, because, I mean, even if you take what he said at face value, all he's commenting on is the makeup of the stone itself. He's not commenting on the actual artifact. He's commenting on the material the artifact is made out of.
Right.
And just because it has a complex matrix doesn't mean that it's not just a common rock.
It means it has a complex matrix, and that's
right.
It,
I mean, chert is complex, but that doesn't make it so special that we never see it, and humans couldn't possibly have worked it, because the entire all of the artifacts from prehistory are pretty much made out of chert.
Yeah, chert's a cryptocrystalline material, and if you know how to break chert, man, you can make sharp edges, and you can make it into just about anything.
Right.
So this nonsense that well, no, it's so hard. It's just that. It just doesn't make any sense. But that's another thing. Another checkbox is make definitive statements. Make absolutely definitive statements that the average person reading it who doesn't know chert, doesn't know what chert is, just knows, well, it's some kind of rock. And if somebody says definitively, you can't break this with normal, even with modern tools, people will take that at face value and say, oh, okay, then it must be something really special or really odd.
I don't like that whole false authority. I just dealt with that. I just finished writing a blog post that's going to go up on that Unearthed America show, which I can't wait to rant about. But that's one of his shticks, is he just states things. He doesn't give you a reason why. He doesn't back it up with anything. He just says A is B, therefore C. And you have if you're just watching the show and you're not even halfway familiar with what he's talking about, you just have to take him at face value, which means you're just accepting whatever comes out of his mouth.
Well, yeah, if you don't know what you're talking about, at least sound confident, and most people will go along with you.
No, and that's true. I mean, that's a fault in our brains. That is true. The television shows and people like this Klaus Donna guy, they really take advantage of that.
Sure.
So, So what else is on your checklist?
All right. So my next list is so in the first one was cite experts, even though those experts have not said anything that supports your theory. Cite them as being interested, as being polite, and it makes it sound like they're there with you. Right. The other kind of experts to cite are people whose credentials you greatly exaggerate, or whose credentials really don't have anything to do with what the study you're engaged in, but it makes it sound like, well, this guy has a degree, this guy is a doctor, therefore he must be a reliable source. One of the, I don't know if you've caught this guy, but in a couple of the websites they cite an expert whose name is Dr. Algund Einboom.
Oh, yeah.
And he's presented as a doctor. And after all, we're talking about a disc that supposedly has all this detailed biological and genetic information. So, of course, a person to cite would be a medical doctor.
Right.
I did a little research on this guy. First of all, and again, I'm not saying this in a way that I hope offends anybody, but Dr. Einboom is not an MD, he's a DDS. The guy's a dentist. Now, if on the genetic disc there was a lot of information about bicuspids and molars, okay, now he can be the expert. But he's not a medical doctor. The guy is a dentist. Now, the other thing that's interesting about Einboom is that his name shows up in a number of other places related to extreme claims made about archaeology. I first find Einboom writing an article for Omni magazine, which was, I think it was a spinoff of like Penthouse back in the 1980s. And he wrote an article in 82 in which he claimed that a little wooden artifact in Egypt called the Saqqara bird, which looks like a little kind of stylized bird made out of wood. His argument was that actually was a small model for a full-sized glider that ancient Egyptians used to fly around Egypt.
So that's where Ancient Aliens got that then, is from him.
Well, the thing is, Einboom actually was on the first season of Ancient Aliens.
Yep.
He was interviewed on the show. So the thing is, this guy is not just some random doctor they approached with this artifact who gave an unbiased, objective, scientific opinion. Number one, he's a dentist. So as far as I'm concerned, that's great if I have a cavity, but not the guy to go to when you're looking for geological or archaeological expertise. But beyond that, he's not just some random guy. He's a guy fully ensconced in the alternative archaeology universe. So he is not the objective observer who you would go to with any artifact to get an unbiased scientific interpretation of what the hell it is that we're looking at. And that's a typical kind of thing that's done again and again and again, that these guys all cite one another. So if you look at Fingerprints of the Gods, of the book by Graham Hancock, who are the people he cites? Well, he cites people who are similarly fringe thinkers, and so it's this big daisy chain of each one reaffirming what the other one says, but never getting out of that universe and finding out, well, how about what really trained scientists in these fields, what do they say? What do they think about these things? And that's typical of this kind of thing.
Yeah. And one of the first things I do when I start researching one of these articles or something, I go to the fringe sites and I see what they're saying and I see who they're claiming to be their experts, and I look those people up. And that's like the first thing you should always do, because
absolutely.
That's how you're going to be able to pick like the actual authorities from people who are being hyped. Because like with this guy, he's got a lineage of doing fringe stuff and pseudo-archaeology. And so that right there should be your first red flag, that whatever this guy is going to say probably needs to be taken with a grain of salt.
Absolutely, for sure. Now, that's great. Continuing on my checklist, I saw on a couple of websites estimates for the age of this disc. Did you see those?
Yeah, and they're like outrageous.
The ones that I saw all hovered around 6,000 years.
Yeah, I have no idea. I still cannot figure out how they managed to get that date.
See, that's absolutely, Sarah. That, I was thinking about that, the date that they give. And if I were to come to you and say, hey, Sarah, I'm digging a site in northwestern Connecticut, and it's like 11,000 years old. Well, what's the question? What's one of the first questions you're going to ask me?
Well, first off, I think it was really cool, but then I'd be like, what are you finding?
Right. And that What's that? Where's that date come from? And then if I told you, well, I have fluted points, so I have the style is right, and I have organic samples. I have charcoal that I sent off to a radiocarbon lab that came back with radiocarbon dates that cluster around that 11,000 year range. You'd be pretty confident. But if I said I got an 11,000-year-old site, and you said, all right, Kenny, how did you date it? And if I said to you, I don't know, it just feels like it's that old.
I have a rock. Just a rock.
It's my intuition says it's that. I've looked and looked and looked, and while they seem to be consistent that they say it's 6,000 years old, not one of the sites explains where did that number come from. And
I think that's what the whole thing with taking it to Dr. Hammer and her group was to try to find a way to claim the date was correct, because they try to attach it to this culture,
right?
And even if they attach it to the culture, it's still too.
Oh yeah, that's so on this checkbox. It's if you look at if you read a claim on a website or see something on a cable show about archaeology, and they just give you, this is how old it is. Trust us. That's pretty typical.
Right.
In other words, without any confirming evidence for, well, why do you think it's that old? What evidence do you have? What techniques did you use to date that site? Are we looking at style? Are we looking at radiocarbon or thermoluminescence or potassium argon dating or any one of a host of other techniques? Which technique did you use? And if they don't tell you, or if when you ask they just say, well, it just looks old, you know you're dealing with fake archaeology, because archaeologists don't work that way. We do not say, we think it could be 1 million years old. How do you know that? Well, I just have that feeling. We don't go with feeling or intuition. We go with actually, hard science data. But then you brought up something which is, again, another one of the check boxes. A lot of times these artifacts, they try to associate them with a particular culture or cultural group. And in this case, it's what the Muisca of South America.
Yeah.
Which is a legitimate, archaeologists have defined that culture, and there's a particular artifact style to it. But that's where, and again, in the case of genuine archaeology, if I'm putting on my website, my campus website, that we've got a site and we think it's like late archaic, or we think it's woodland, or we believe it's Paleo-Indian, I'm giving you there's a time involved there, and there's a certain cultural background or milieu that is implied by use of those terms. And then I have to define what those terms mean, and I have to justify, why do you say it's that period? Why do you say it's that culture? Why do I say, well, this looks Mohegan, but this looks Pequot? The deal is, when they say it's Muisca, on what, never in any of these websites do they explain exactly, well, on what basis do you say that? And they ignore the fact that the typical Muisca stuff that I've seen is about 1,000 years old. It's not 6,000 years old. So all these pieces of the puzzle are absolutely not fitting together, and that's pretty typical of this.
Well, and it doesn't, if you do go and look up the Muisca people, I mean, this is the other thing that irritates me. The Muisca people are still around. They're a living tribe. Yes. Right. And their stuff is, I mean, even their prehistoric stuff is all over the place. So you can compare stylistically the disc and its associated pieces with actual artifacts and artwork from the Muisca people, and it doesn't even begin to look like anything that they would have done.
Yeah, I mean, even from a pretty subjective kind of eyeballing it, and that's not how we want to do this, but if somebody handed me that disc and handed me a bunch of pieces of Muisca art, I would not immediately say, wow, that disc looks a lot like this stuff. I wouldn't put them in the same category at all. Right. And I think that again, that's another one of these examples of, well, they really don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what they're doing. But hey, it's from South America. They are claiming it's from an area where Muisca people today live. So they're trying to make that connection.
Right. And like the material itself that it's made out of, it doesn't take that. It's not that hard to look up the Muisca people, and that's not even a material that they would have used to create their artwork with anyway. Right, so it's too many red flags.
Right, exactly. This is one of my absolute favorites, and this is an important rule for everybody who's interested in pseudoarchaeology. A lot of times in pseudoarchaeology, they will show the person who's purveying this alternative view of antiquity. They will show you a work of art, say a cave painting, or a design on a pot, or a carved sarcophagus lid. And Palenque, the Pakal's sarcophagus lid from the Maya site of Palenque is a great example of this. And essentially what they will do is they will prompt you as to what you should be seeing in the art that is often very not realistic at all. It's very kind of surreal. But they prompt you, and that is typically what happens. Because ultimately, in so many of these cases, if you weren't prompted to see, well, doesn't that look like an astronaut? Doesn't that look like a sperm cell? Doesn't that look like an ovum? Without that prompting, you wouldn't see that.
Exactly.
The example is the Palenque sarcophagus lid, which maybe we'll talk about a lot more in another podcast. But that's the one that's very famous now. It's iconic. Yeah. It's the lid of a sarcophagus found at the base of a Maya pyramid at the site of Palenque. The ruler's name is Pakal, and it's this beautiful work of carving. I guess it's a bas relief. And Von Daniken and people before him and people since have said, doesn't that look like an astronaut in a spaceship?
Right. And
to be honest with you, it's very difficult for me at this point to sort of erase that from my brain and say, well, does that look anything like that? But so what I do in class is I do a little experiment in class. I pick another image entirely, not a well-known one, not one that the students in my class have ever seen before, but of an artifact that Eric Von Daniken says, look, this is something amazing. And then he tells people in the caption of the photograph what it is they're looking at. And I've done this for a few years, Sarah, and I've never had a student who, without prompting, to independently come up with the same thing that Von Daniken says it is. Yeah. Von Daniken, in fact, the image that I use in class all the time, Von Daniken says it is clearly evidence that extraterrestrials landed on Earth and then did chest X-rays of the natives because the image shows ribs. Because simple primitive people would not know that human beings had ribs without a chest X-ray. Right. So the thing is, though, you show them to students and unprompted, they say, well, I don't know, looks like a guy in armor or something. But then if I then say to another group of students, look at this image, doesn't it look like a chest X-ray? Like 3/4 of them say, yeah, now that you mention it, it does. Well, that's typically what happens in these cases. When I looked at that disc, I tried not to read what I was supposed to be seeing.
Right.
And I just saw, okay, there is what appears to be a woman with like her vagina, and there does appear to be a guy, and there's his penis, but all the other stuff seemed so vague. And then only later reading it, I said, oh my God, they're saying those are sperm cells? They're saying that's an egg cell? And either I have a very limited imagination, or I don't see any of the things that they're saying should be there. And that's pretty typical. And, we are all very, very, our brains are pattern-seeking machines. And we're very suggestible. If somebody says, you look up at a cloud, and somebody says, doesn't that look like a pirate ship? Well, now that you think about it, and now that you mention it, okay, yeah, it does. But without somebody telling you, look at that, doesn't it look like a pirate ship? You probably wouldn't see the pirate ship. And that's a general rule here, is if you open any of these books, hide the caption. Do not read what the guy says he thinks it is. Look at it and see what you come up with, kind of like an ink blot test. And then look at the caption, and I bet you more often than not, until somebody tells you what you're supposed to see, you won't see it because it's really not there. It's entirely in the imagination of the person writing the caption.
Exactly. Those aren't all your checkpoints, are they?
Oh, I have more.
Okay.
I have more. This is something that bothers the hell out of me, and it's a very typical kind of ruse used by these folks. And that is, you and I both have looked at this thing and said, you know what? I don't know what the hell the thing is, but it certainly doesn't look legit. It looks like it's a fake. It looks like it's some kind of a forgery. Probably very recent because we have evidence that modern tools were used. And then the response, and I'm sure you've heard this response, but wow. No forger would go to all that work to do that.
Of course they
would. You just kind of walk away. Well, here's a quote from one of the websites. Quote, "But why should a forger forge something that does not fit into any scheme we are familiar with?" Isn't that bizarre?
That's the whole point.
I know. How is that? But this is typical that somehow these guys think they. So let's say that the people interpreting these artifacts are not the responsible parties. They are not the forgers. They are just people who have been kind of sucked into this belief system, and so they're interpreting this object, this artifact, as something completely outrageous. Well, the deal is then what they believe that they can kind of do the psychology of a forger, and they think they know what a forger would be intending. And so they'll say, well, a forger wouldn't go to a lot of work. A forger wouldn't make a whole bunch of them. And a forger wouldn't make something that's so extraordinary that it would really get people's attention, which seems to be exactly the opposite of what a good forger would do. I mean, certainly there are forgers who want to make objects that are such dead-on, accurate replications of genuine stuff, so they can sell it as the real thing, like painting coming up with a painting and saying this is a Da Vinci. It's an unknown work by Leonardo da Vinci, and have that forger would make something that was so accurate, such an accurate replica that it would somebody would buy it, and spend a lot of money on it. But there's the other side of forgery, which is, listen, there obviously is a ready market for bizarre, crazy stuff. And the Ecostones are a great example. I mean, when this guy was carving, people writing on dinosaurs, what was it, the Flintstones? People conducting heart transplants ostensibly thousands of years ago. And, well, the forger behind those has come out and confessed, yup, I did it. I've got a workshop here. I have workers under me. We work these, we punch these things out. Tourists love them. And so it certainly would not be a legitimate argument that, yes, but those are such weird images, so outside of the norm, no forger would do that. That is categorically false, but it's a typical thing referenced by these folks trying to support the authenticity of what clearly is a forged object, just by giving us these arguments that really intrinsically don't make any sense, but again, they sound definitive, like they've done a study of forgery, and if this were a forgery, it would go against everything we know about forgeries. But it's just
they make it sound like they've done all this research into whatever it is. Like, just for example, the Newbery tablet, which is in episode 3 of Unearthed America, and I just got done reviewing it. Uh-huh. It's the big deal about it is that it's written in Ionian linear script A, which apparently the time between the discovery of the tablet and the discovery of the Ionian culture was like there was a 5-year gap. Okay. And the tablet came first. Therefore, there's no way that the tablet could possibly be a forgery because nobody knew what the Ionian language was. Mm. Until 5 years after the tablet was discovered. Therefore, it must be real. And it's like, you can't come up with any other way to explain how that could possibly have happened, and that still is a forgery. Because it's not even the script that you're claiming it is to begin with. It's gibberish. So it's still basically a fake. And it's just... But you're such an expert in Ionian Linear A that you can spot it dead on and pronounce it to be authentic by staring at it for 20 minutes,
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, there's no limit to the twists and turns that people use in order to force something to fit a preconceived notion. And although this, I don't think applies in the case of the genetic disc, but what's really funny is a lot of these inscriptions that are claimed to be in North America that are claimed to be either it's Hebrew or it's Ogham, this Celtic script, or it's runic. the funny thing about that is that when an inscription is found, if there are errors in it, if epigraphers, if people who study these scripts say, well, no, this thing is a fake because there are some serious errors in the spelling, in the syntax, in the way what the supporters of this very often will say, the inaccuracies and the errors are exactly the kind of proof used by them to show that it's legit, because their argument is, well, some guy wandering around in New Mexico 2,000 years ago, he probably didn't know Hebrew all that well. So if it were perfect, then we should be suspicious. So it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't. If the inscription is perfect, it's a see that they couldn't have done that perfectly if it was a forgery. But if it's imperfect, if there are mistakes, it's like, well, that's what you'd expect 2,000 years ago from some guy who was barely literate wandering around in New Mexico or in New England or in Michigan or wherever. When you do science, one of the key issues in a scientific hypothesis is that it's got to be falsifiable. You have to be able to say, listen, this is something that with the right kind of data, I can prove that it's not true. But if you're saying that this disc or this inscription is legit, and no matter what you find out about it, I'm going to reject that as being disconfirmation of a hypothesis, then that's great, but you're not doing science. For science, we have to set up in advance, listen, if we find this, this, and this, but not this, this, and this, we have to reject that hypothesis.
And
but if whatever you find is, oh yeah, that's fine, well then you're not doing science.
No, and there's two things happening there. That's the misunderstanding of what a hypothesis is and how science works through a hypothesis. And I'm sorry, I blame our school system for that. And the other thing that's happening is they're moving the goalpost. And that's a very common denier tactic, is to, okay, well, you proved this wrong, but can you prove this wrong? Okay, well, you proved that wrong, but now can you prove this wrong? You know, they keep moving the goalpost, so you can't ever satisfy whatever they need you to satisfy for them to believe you. You know, and it gets really aggravating because you're like, but I just proved 3 different things to you, and there's whatever you're asking for now is just ridiculous. And
you know, the thing that's even more bothersome, Sarah, is that sometimes then the goalposts are just ignored entirely. So you have something like, for example, I hope a lot of the listeners are familiar with the Nazca lines, these spectacular geoglyphs in South America. And there was an instance in which, in one of von Daniken's books, he's got what appears to be an aerial photograph of one of the Nazca geoglyphs. And what he says in the caption is, doesn't this look like the parking bay at a modern airport? And there are these oblong sections where maybe you could park an airplane, and it kind of does. If you take an aerial view of an airport, this looked kind of like that. Now, when you actually go down on the ground, first of all, the thing is only like 20 feet across, so there's no way it could be an airport. And number two, that this particular part of this geoglyph was in the leg of a giant condor that had been etched into the desert. Now, when von Daniken, in a television documentary back in the 80s, when he was confronted with it and said, so clearly your hypothesis here is crazy, and he actually admitted on camera, oh, yes, this is wrong, this was a mistake that somebody made, and it's absolutely ridiculous, it's not an airport. So, okay, we've told him, we've deflected the kick from the goalposts, right? So no, you don't get that. But you know what? In subsequent editions of the book, they never changed it.
He's notorious for that, though. He is notorious for, and Hancock does the same thing. If you point it out to them face to face, they will backtrack, but they won't change it, and they'll continue, and willfully continue to leave it in their manuscripts and push it forward in future books and future editions. Von Daniken's been called out on that number of times.
Sure.
And Hancock got called out on public television. Okay. So, they're both notorious for doing that.
Yes. So it's like, you're right, they move the goalposts, but then no matter where the goalposts are, ultimately they just kind of ignore the goalposts.
Yeah.
And say, whatever. We're not worried about goalposts.
They're not. They're just throwing them out there to aggravate whoever it is that's saying they're wrong.
Right.
Or trying to prove that they're wrong.
Yep. And that's the last checkbox here, because we've been going on a little long on this, is But you know what it is? I bring up Von Daniken. Von Daniken is the champ at this. Graham Hancock is really good at this, and in a bunch of the websites on the disc, they're really good at this, which is when you read it carefully, there are very few absolute affirmative statements. There are a lot of, maybe, could be, possibly, imagine, and when you look at it, you go, wait a minute, they're not saying outright. The way if you publish an article in an archaeology journal, you have to say, this is what I've concluded about this site. Now, you can have stuff you're not sure about. That's fine. But you can say, this is how old the site is. This is a stratigraphic context. These are the raw materials used to produce the artifacts. So you have to be able to actually say something affirmative about the site and about the artifacts you've recovered at the site. But these guys, they're really clever at couching everything in these hypotheticals. Well, maybe. What if this was legit? Maybe this could have actually been found. And when you get done, you have a whole lot of nothing, right?
Yeah.
There's no actual evidence. It's all a bunch of, well, maybe, coulda, shoulda, possibly. Von Daniken is a champ at that. And you read the book the first time, you go, oh my God, these crazy things he's saying. And you go back, you realize, well, and he'll say this as well. I'm merely bringing up some possible ideas. But, could be, maybe is not definite is. It's, could be, maybe. And it's, if pigs could fly, well, maybe they could. But now we need to talk about science and what evidence do you have that the pigs are actually flying? Because then, we have to all go out with umbrellas if there are flying pigs, because we don't want to be pelted by all that stuff coming out of the back end of pigs.
Well, but they do that. They do the whole, couching it in these abstract terms. But then in the next sentence, they will continue on and they will actually change their language so that it's no longer a possibility, it's a definite fact.
Yeah, and then when you call them on it, they say, well, everything that followed after that first sentence was, of course, hypothetical, because it all depended on the first sentence being true, and they certainly don't prove that.
They're masters at backpedaling, I'll give them that.
Well, and of course they rely on people kind of ignoring if this is true, then, and then they just read the next 10 pages, in which everything is definitive, and then you forget that but it all depends on that first supposition being upheld, and there's no evidence provided for that.
Right. And it just, in general, if you've ever had even like a high school logic course, it just tears the argument apart.
Exactly. Now, for anybody listening to us and saying, well, come on, guys, well, how do you know the genetic disk is a fake or fraud? Here's the bottom line, is that, and this is the importance of peer-reviewed publications, is that at this point, nobody's done this. In science, science is different from a court where you're innocent until proven guilty. A claim about an archaeological artifact is not considered true until somebody disproves it. That's not the way science works. The burden of proof is on people saying, we've got this incredible artifact. And now that burden of proof will involve whoever is claiming this to actually write a paper providing all the data behind the disc, including where did it come from, where was it excavated, what's the stratigraphic context, how can we date this thing? What's the analysis of the artifact itself? And having that peer-reviewed and published in a journal where people like Sara and I can actually read all the details that you're not going to get in a one-page website so that we can come to some definitive conclusion. But without that, we always start by thinking, all right, this thing ain't kosher. This is not real. Prove to us that it is. But they're certainly not doing that because all they're doing is kind of mouthing off on a website. That's not the way archaeology works. It's not the way science works. We don't hold press conferences. We don't, make claims on websites. What we do is we do the analysis. We write it up. We publish it, and anybody can read those articles and see exactly how we reach the conclusions that we've actually reached. And Sara, you brought this up in a previous podcast that that can take a long time. That's not something you do overnight. That's something that can take years. But because what goes in print, that's the permanent record. We want it to be we want to make that as legitimate as we possibly can. We want to be as certain as we possibly can be before we commit something to print. And because
Yeah, it's your professional reputation you're throwing out on the line there. I mean, you don't want to look like an idiot. So you got to make sure all your I's are dotted and all your T's are crossed. I mean, scientists in general and archaeologists especially don't just throw crap out there because it is way too easy to look like an idiot. So it's just better to make sure that you've got all your ducks in a row before you put something out there, because as nice as the field can be, you don't want to be getting a whole bunch of bad reviews, and your paper's going to get sent back if it's too bad. They're just going to send it back to you and tell you, no, we're not publishing this, or redo it, and you don't want to redo it. That's just the reality of it. If you've spent 2 years getting everything together to publish this paper, you really don't want them sending it back to you and telling you, no, this is crap, redo the whole thing.
Absolutely. But on the other hand, that's kind of it's a filtering mechanism that actually protects us in the end. So that, and you, Sarah, I will fully admit that you get so involved in a project and you get so much down into that wormhole that when you reach a point where you can't see the error, the logical error, you can't see yourself, the missing piece of the puzzle. And that's when they send it out to 5 or 6 people, and when 2 or 3 of them say, wow, this is great, but I still have these questions, and you go, crap, that's right. I just completely forgot that, ignored that. I was not aware of that citation. Oh my God, I did this math error. So in the end, we personally benefit from other people telling us we've made mistakes, and the field benefits from that kind of a filtering mechanism. But the deal is, if these people want to show that the genetic disc is legit, they have to go through that process.
Well, and the other
otherwise, we're never going to know.
Right. And another problem with the genetic disc is something we talked about in the first podcast, is the whole thing of context. They just have these artifacts. They don't have any record. They have a story of how these artifacts were found, but they don't have any documentation. These artifacts have there's nothing recorded in association with them. We don't know how they were found. We don't know if they were in a pit. We don't know if they were on the ocean floor. We don't know where these things came from, except somewhere in South America. And that doesn't tell us anything.
That provenience is pretty wide, a continent.
Right, exactly. That's a whole continent there, or at least the lower half of one. So, and that's, I think, people who legitimately believe that these are artifacts and that we are being dismissive of them, I don't think they understand that it's not that it is that we're dismissing them, but we're dismissing them because they're unprovenienced, they're out of context, they don't mean anything. If we even pretended for a minute that they were real artifacts, they would be completely lost and useless to us, because there's absolutely no information we can get from them, because we don't know anything about the history of the artifact itself, as far as the point where it was lost by whoever created it and then modern people found it. If I've got something sitting in my basement and it's been sitting in my basement for 40 years and I know that my grandfather pulled it out of a field somewhere, that does no one any good. All I've got is a neat artifact that sits in my basement now. I mean, it could be like the missing link to some great mystery, but it's gone now. Right. It's useless.
Without documentation, archaeology is so much about documentation. Photograph everything, measure everything. Because when we excavate a site, effectively, we destroy all those contexts and associations. Exactly. So we have to keep record of them. I'll never forget the time we were doing an archaeological survey here in Connecticut, and among the things we were looking at were people's private artifact collections. So, and in most cases, people basically had arrowheads in cigar boxes. Why cigar boxes? I don't know. But it's kind of the standard. And when you would ask people, all right, where did these come from? Most people could say Connecticut, around, but where exactly? Oh, I don't know, because they didn't keep an accurate record of what they found, where they found it, when they found it, in which field they found it, because that wasn't what they were doing. And ultimately that removes a lot of the valuable information. And in one case, we do not, here in Connecticut, we don't have volcanic cones. We don't have any obsidian, volcanic glass. We have volcanic material. We have igneous rock, but no obsidian. And to my knowledge, we have never in Connecticut found any obsidian artifacts traded from far away. Well, I went through somebody's private collection, and there in the middle of that was exactly one obsidian spear point. Now,
no.
had the person who owned the collection, had they not known better, I'd be sitting there thinking, well, where did that come from? Was that actually found in Connecticut? I mean, obsidian reached as far east, I know, as Ohio and maybe even western Pennsylvania through trade. Well, the person who owned this collection happened to know, he meets with other arrowhead collectors, and he saw somebody who had an obsidian point, so he traded him for, a Connecticut basalt point for an obsidian point from who knows where. But if that guy wasn't around, I'd be sitting there with an artifact saying, just like you said, is this like a really important discovery? Is this the first evidence of prehistoric trade between Connecticut and, I don't know, Wyoming or Idaho? But again, without documentation, with just, it was, a story about where it came from, that really is, that's problematic. So yeah, without a specific and detailed description of where that genetic disc was found, what it was found with, where it was found in the stratigraphic column, we just have it's a just so story, which is a lot like the crystal skulls and a lot like a bunch of other stuff, where we have no record of where it comes from, where it originated, what its context was. All we have is a guy holding us the artifact going, isn't this cool? Well, it would be a lot cooler if we had some documentation for where it came from. And my initial reaction when handed something like that is, there is no context. There is no documentation. Somebody made it in his basement.
Right. Well, and that's the thing. It's when you get artifacts that people bring you, and they're doing it because they want to show you the cool thing that they found, and I understand that. But even if it is that groundbreaking artifact that you've been waiting your whole life to find, you have to throw it out. You can't use it. I mean, you can write it up and say this collector has this point, but you can't associate it with anything, so it does no one any good. And it can be a real tragedy. I mean, I've worked in fields where basically because the entire town goes there to collect, they've basically collected an entire site, and judging by the artifacts that they've found, it was a pretty significant site, but it's gone now because they've collected everything and then plowed the field a million times.
Yeah, you have a box of cool artifacts, but that's about it.
Yeah, it's like, this does me no good. And the worst part of it is since I do CRM, a lot of times we're out there. I like to feel like I'm the first line of defense. And so you're out there trying to find these sites so that you can basically, if it's a significant enough of a site, sometimes they have to reroute around it. So you've got all these people who want to protect their land. And it's like, well, one of the best ways to protect your land is to leave the damn artifacts there for me to find them, because then I can say, there's a site here you might want to reroute.
There you go.
But
what's
it's
really
hard to
wonderful,
explain that to people.
Yeah. What's wonderful, though, is when you find these collectors. I ran into a collector who, Sarah, this guy recorded the exact location of where he found everything he ever picked up out of the ground.
That's awesome.
I mean, his records were better than records I've seen kept by professional archaeologists. And he was a young guy who did a lot of, and he never dug. He only collected stuff from plowed fields. And he invited me into his basement where he had what looked like it was a museum, where every piece he had a record of where everything came from. And I told this guy, you know what, you ought to take like a course in archaeology, because you've kind of discovered archaeological methodology on your own. That guy today has a PhD in anthropology and runs a CRM firm in Connecticut.
Nice.
He was selling appliances, and he decided, you know what, I like archaeology better. And he's one of the best field archaeologists I know.
Well, that's like the man site here in Indiana. It's named after the guy who discovered it. He's not around anymore, but he was an untrained amateur enthusiast, and his records are so meticulous that we can recreate the site from his records. Right. And it's like, which is unheard of for that time. But
and you got to think, look, if a guy collecting arrowheads in Connecticut or a guy collecting artifacts in Indiana if they have the presence of mind to keep records of everything, somebody finding this incredible genetic disc I think we can expect that they should have done the same thing if, in fact, somebody actually found it.
Yeah, that's the thing. If you find something really cool and you just can't keep yourself from picking it up, take the most detailed record you possibly could. Take measurements, use your phone, take pictures, get GPS. We're a modern society today. Almost everyone has a phone. Right. Use it to the full extent of its abilities and, keep as meticulous a record as you can. Because I tell you, if an archaeology crew comes out there, it'll be hours before anything happens because of just all of the setup and the beginning measurements and the beginning depths and the pictures and the this and the that gets set up before anything's even done.
Sure. So, I think that those of people listening to this podcast have to understand that ultimately with this genetic disc, I just don't see any way in which its validity can be upheld, because if there ever were data that we would need in order to ascertain the legitimacy of this, it's gone. It's you say, it's like now at this point we just have this one kind of peculiar artifact, and people can make up stories about what the images look like or how old it is or what culture it's associated with. But they've effectively destroyed this object. If there's any legitimacy to it all, if it were real, they've destroyed it by simply, it's archaeology by press conference, archaeology by blog, archaeology by, well, look what we found. Well, you can't put something back in situ once it's been yanked out. So
right, and I mean, you're being a lot nicer than I am, because I straight wrote it off and I still write it off. I mean, there is nothing to suggest that this artifact is legitimate. But
listen, bottom line is, there's nothing here to suggest, to recommend the legitimacy or reality of this artifact.
No. Okay. Well, I hope we talked the genetic disc to death.
But it was good because we put it in this really broad context of how you assess fake.
No, I think it's great. Yeah. I like your checklist, actually.
There you go. Everybody should have one. You should have like a little copy on your cell phone, so that when you're somebody's talking about some weird artifact, you can check things off and go, oh no, he's over the minimum, over the maximum number that we can accept for a legitimate artifact. You can just walk away.
There's an app to make.
Extrapolating from a single stone the extent of a whole complex and then publishing it.
If you'd like to support the podcast, consider donating to us on Patreon or Ko-fi. Either option helps us out. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on the blog, www.archyfantasies.com, and like and share us wherever you can. You can follow us on Twitter @ArchyFantasies, or you can reach us by email at archyfantasies@gmail.com. That's ARCHY fantasies@gmail.com. Theme music was provided by Archaeosuit Productions. This episode was produced and edited by Sarah Head.
No, we don't do dinosaurs. We don't do dinosaurs. See? Are you happy? Do you get it now? Do you get it? Honestly.